I found it pretty difficult to distill this case down for writing this introduction. Viewed through a relationship lens, this case really highlights how far two women would go for the men that they loved. One woman, grieving the loss of her beloved, vowed to work towards a more effective military justice system. The other helped hide her fugitive boyfriend and, after his arrest, tacked up a sign that said, "We have no comment." As you've probably guessed, this case isn't about these women at all, but rather the reverberations from the repeated and varied criminal actions of Specialist Lee. This is Conduct Unbecoming. I'm Erin, and I'm your host. I'm going to kick this case off with two important notes. First, I will briefly mention child sexual abuse. I have no intention of detailing it. I don't like to blindside anybody, so I'm giving that note up top. Second, there is no appellate opinion for this case, so I had to rely on news coverage. Where there was conflict between articles regarding specific details, I wrote to the lowest common denominator. Where that wasn't possible, I specifically called out the inconsistency. That introduction given, let's get into it. Jonathan Kang Lee joined the Army, and when he was approximately 22 years old, the Army stationed him at Joint Base Lewis McChord near Tacoma, Washington. There, he worked as a signal intelligence analyst with the 201st Expeditionary Military Intelligence Brigade, promoting to specialist. Then, in April 2022, Lee was removed from his position after his two stepdaughters, both minors, came forward and reported what they endured at his hands. The girls were young, but articles vary on their ages. One source described them as 8 and 4 years old, and others placed the eldest between 12 and 16, and the other under 12. I haven't uncovered more information about Lee's family and their ages, but I've also not really looked. The girls reported being raped and sexually assaulted between 2020 and 2022. The state of Washington filed charges against Lee in 2022 with multiple counts of rape and molestation of a child. The state then dismissed those charges in September 2022 when it became clear the military was pursuing charges for the same underlying acts. This was potentially in part because some of the acts took place or may have taken place in Georgia, or beyond Washington's jurisdiction. There are more details out there about what happened to the two children, but we're not going to get into those details because ultimately it's not that important to this case. We know from the way that Lee was charged that these acts occurred after he joined the Army. Had the acts taken place before Lee joined, the Army wouldn't have had jurisdiction over the crimes. Lee's court-martial for the sex-based offenses was set for January 2024, and the Army placed restrictions on his movement, but notably did not place him in pretrial confinement. Lee was confined to the base and had to check in each day with an officer. It's not quite clear if that was a duty officer generally or a specific officer in Lee's command. Although it's not mentioned anywhere, I would imagine there was an on-base restraining order in place to keep him away from anywhere children might congregate, for obvious reasons. And even though Lee faced significant prison time because of his charges, they hadn't been proven yet. By confining him to post with daily check-ins, barring contact with his reported victims, and whatever other restrictions may have been imposed, those were likely the least restrictive conditions that the Army could impose to prevent further sexual violence while Lee awaited his court-martial. On January 14, 2024, 2 days before his court-martial was set to begin, Lee climbed into the driver's seat of a white 2011 Honda Pilot and disappeared. He claims he set his mind on either dying by suicide or deserting the Army. When Lee missed his daily check-in, the Army Criminal Investigation Division issued a Be on the Lookout, a BOLO, including 2 photos of Lee and a photo of a white Honda Pilot. In the hours after he deserted, Lee's Honda Pilot broke down. He claims he paid a tow truck to retrieve it, which is objectively the wrong choice. Given the nature of his general plans, spending money on abandoning the broken-down Pilot makes no sense. It's not like he was actually going to pick up the car from impound, presenting his ID to reclaim it. By his own reports, he either would have never needed a car again or wouldn't risk exposing that he was a fugitive. So whatever the case, whatever the circumstances under which he separated from the Honda Pilot, in the early morning hours of January 15th, Lee hailed a red Toyota taxi driven by Nicholas Hokema. Money dwindling, Lee planned to have Nicholas drop him at a bus stop, a slightly less expensive form of transport. But perhaps with the weight of his court-martial and his plans weighing on him, Lee claims he began to feel ill. He rerouted Nicholas, asking him to stop at a mall just east of the Seattle-Tacoma International Airport. And I will pause for a moment here to say that if this fact pattern, a man facing conviction for sex crimes running away from military custody in Washington, tickles something in your memory, you might be thinking of Prefka from episode 55. In the morning on January 15th, police received a call summoning them to the mostly empty 6,700 space lot at the mall near the airport. There, officers discovered a man's lifeless body, bearing multiple stab wounds. Lee was convicted in absentia 5 days after his disappearance, on January 19th. The articles I read didn't cover how his absence was explained to the mixed panel of officers and enlisted personnel that found him guilty of his sex crimes. He was sentenced to 64 years of confinement and a reduction to E1. On January 26th, 11 days after investigators discovered a body in the mall parking lot, they located Nicholas's cab in a residential area in Redmond, Washington, about 50 miles north of JBLM. Investigators apprehended Lee at a nearby apartment complex, hiding out in his girlfriend's apartment. At first, I thought that was a little bit odd, because we knew that Lee was certainly married. But it's probably safe to assume the charges filed in 2022 ended that relationship. When agents arrived at his girlfriend's door, the girlfriend warned him, and he hid behind a bed in an upstairs bedroom, before jumping from the second-story window. Lee wrestled with the agents, grabbing at one of their guns, before they knocked him to the ground, cuffed him, and took him away. At that time, Lee was only a person of interest in Nicholas's death. Nicholas was survived by his partner, Nicole, their 2 cats, and their dog, as well as other family members. In the weeks after his death, Nicole discovered that Nicholas had been searching for engagement rings. Now in the custody of the Army, Lee began to serve his 64-year sentence at the Northwest Joint Regional Correctional Facility on JBLM. Soon that confinement began to serve a dual purpose, began to serve as pre-trial confinement, when Lee was finally named a suspect and then charged for Nicholas's death. In September 2024, the Army Office of Special Trial Counsel arraigned Lee. This time, Lee faced charges of premeditated murder, murder while perpetrating a robbery, or felony murder, the robbery being the theft of the taxi, resisting arrest, wrongful use of a controlled substance, and failing to obey a lawful order. I have no notes on what substance he wrongfully consumed or whether there was a laced sugar bowl in play at his girlfriend's apartment. I want to take a quick detour here to explain that the Office of Special Trial Counsel was congressionally mandated. They were created to handle special victim cases, homicides, kidnappings, rapes, and a whole host of other sex crimes. In addition to creating a special team to handle the most sensitive cases, the congressional action severed decision-making authority from commanders and placed it in the hands of prosecutors. Prosecutors handling these sensitive cases can now use that independent discretion to decide whether to take a case forward and what charges to bring. Commanders who previously held that authority are no longer burdened with the scrutiny that comes with declining to move forward on a case, and can avoid the appearance of bias, or the appearance that the Good Ol' Boys Club was taking care of one of their own in the face of a sex crime allegation. I should note, that last part, about not being burdened with the scrutiny that comes with announcing you are or are not taking a case forward, that part is my gloss. I'm certain there are commanders who view this shift as undermining their authority. But that prosecutorial discretion and severing decision-making from command lines up more closely with the civilian system. As a civilian, I can't imagine reporting a sexual assault only to be informed that the case wasn't advancing because the perpetrator's boss doesn't think it should. Last month, in April 2025, Lee pled guilty to first-degree murder, admitting he stabbed Nicholas in the back of the head and chest. Security footage from the mall parking lot showed Lee and Nicholas struggling in the lot at about 4 o'clock in the morning. Lee claimed that he intended only to brandish his knife in an attempt to get Nicholas to back down in their dispute over how much his taxi ride cost. But Lee admitted that he knew Nicholas was unarmed, and that he did not think Nicholas was going to kill or seriously hurt him. He described stabbing Nicholas in the chest, then in his neck or head as he slumped over the middle console. During his plea colloquy, the military judge attempted to clarify, to confirm that Lee stabbed Nicholas to death, and that he was pleading as much. Lee replied that there was a lot of blood, and he didn't think Nicholas would live. Lee also pled guilty to desertion, resisting arrest, and 2 specifications of failure to obey a lawful order. In exchange for his plea, the government dropped charges of premeditated murder and robbery, and took the death penalty off the table. During the sentencing phase of his trial, character witnesses clambered into the witness box to explain how Lee was a good guy. Lee himself described the violent childhood he had growing up in Virginia, detailing physical abuse from his brother, mother, and father. Like many others, he joined the army to get away from home. When he deployed to Afghanistan, he felt it gave him purpose, but upon his return to the United States in 2019, and his assignment to JBLM, he said every aspect of his life was spiraling. On the other end of the spectrum, Nicholas's family and Nicole. discussed the pain that Lee's violence caused them, the loss they endured at his hands. Taking all of that into consideration, the military judge sentenced Lee to life in prison, forfeiture of all pay and allowances, and a dishonorable discharge. The life sentence is to be served consecutively to the 64-year term for the sexual violence against his stepdaughters. Because 64 years plus a life sentence is more than 10 years, Lee will serve his sentence at the U.S. Disciplinary Barracks in Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. He'll be eligible for parole no earlier than 2045. To the extent he files an appeal that the Army Court of Criminal Appeals takes up or the Court of Appeal for the Armed Forces, I'll be sure to update you. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed today's episode, please share it. I invite you to submit case suggestions and feedback to conductunbecomingpod@gmail.com or on conductunbecomingpod.com. Join me next time when we take on the altitude in Japan. Until then, take care. Conduct Unbecoming is a podcast where I get to talk about interesting crimes and cases that involve U.S. military service members. I research, write, and produce the podcast myself. The opinions expressed are my own, and perhaps it's obvious. Conduct Unbecoming is not approved, authorized, or endorsed by the Department of Defense.